Yeah. Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Where to start?
Well,
I was not brought up. I am not cradle Orthodox. I was not even brought up in a pious household.
Right.
My father, he was an immigrant from Sweden, and he wasn't terribly. He was a very compassionate being, but he was not what you would describe as religious in a sense.
Yeah.
In fact, in 1921-22, when he was in the Swedish Navy, he had actually traveled to some of the ports in northern Russia. He had visited Russia, and he was very impressed. He was very impressed by what he saw. So he always had very leftist leanings. When I was sometime 12, 13 years old, two of my cousins, who were Irish Americans, married into an Albanian family, and they were Orthodox Christians, and there was a very vibrant Albanian community in Boston at that time. I presume it still exists. In fact, they had a cathedral in this old Protestant church. So I had Orthodox connections there. Also, now when I was in university, I did some Eastern European studies, the Russian language, and I got very interested in these things. But one of the things that I remember very well was watching a television program with my father, and he was interested in showing me the Russian Revolution. But what I got fascinated was a scene from one of Sergei Eisenstein's film, Ivan Grozny, and the coronation of Ivan. There's a deacon with a great big beard chanting, and I said, wow, I would love to go to a church like that. I was very impressed by it. Now, the other thing that I remember very well, when I was in university, I used to deliver post at Christmas, and as you know well how cold it is, and you're tramping from house to house. And I was in this apartment building, and I had to ring the doorbell to deliver a package, and this Greek priest came, and he insisted I came in. I sat down, I had some coffee, his wife was fussing, giving me things, and I remember seeing holy icons on the walls and candelia, and I thought maybe they were decorations for Christmas. I didn't know.
Right.
And so there was that kind of thing. So when I finally, with great trepidation, set foot in this Russian church in Boston one day, just out of curiosity. That was it. That's where it stayed. It's not, Saul on the way to Damascus. It's a very slow.
Where this church used to be?
It's still there in Boston.
Is Roslindale?
Bay.
In Roslindale?
No, Roslindale. That's a much later thing. That was actually Russian Church in Exile or Russian Church abroad.
Right.
And that wasn't there when I was young, but I had a friend who was a Greek guy. He's a dentist, and he happened to say to me, "We have an Orthodox church." He was Greek Orthodox, and this would have been sometime, I think, in the late '60s, early '70s. I was in there once.
In Roslindale, you mean?
Yeah, have you been there?
Yes.
You've been there, yeah. But the place I went was the Orthodox, became OCA.
Oh, Holy Trinity.
Holy Trinity.
Okay.
Yeah. There was a whole load. Boston was very ethnocentric when I was growing up. Remember, I was born in 1940, so things haven't changed that much, almost from the turn of the century. Things changed and got fragmented, I think, probably in the 60s. So, for example, there was a large Ukrainian church in Boston. That was Uniat. And then there was the Greek seminary there. And then there was an offshoot. There was an old Calendaris group there as well.
Right.
I don't know if they're still there, but
yeah. In Brookline.
In Brookline, yeah. So you had these different things. Unfortunately, there wasn't a great deal of communication between the groups. From what I think, as an outsider, as a non-cradle Orthodox with no ethnic loyalties, I never had a problem. Now, I often considered myself Russian Orthodox because that's where I converted. But I have no problem, going to the Romanian community we have in Cork, or there's an Antiochian group that comes maybe once every couple of months. There's some Bulgarians. I help out in whatever way I can,
Right.
and I think that's important. Okay, it may be that the future for Orthodoxy in Ireland maybe we'll all end up as English-speaking parishes anyway, but it doesn't make any difference. The important thing is the witness is there. But that was my introduction, and
you were received into Orthodoxy at that Holy Trinity Cathedral.
yeah, sometime I was 21. Something I can't remember.
Late 1960s.
Yeah. I remember meeting one of these born-again Christians who said to me one time, "When did you become a Christian?" I'm not sure. Well, I did on April 20. He gave me almost the hour, and I thought, well, it didn't work that way with me. I didn't have the Holy Spirit descend directly on me. And
one can say that I am still working on this.
Right? I'm still working on this, yeah, and I think that's a healthy thing. Yeah. Now, this all comes to an end when I was 33 years old, and I met a 21-year-old art student from Dublin. And 40 years later, we're still together, and 4 children and 5 grandchildren and everything. But so I ended up moving here in a weak moment in the late 70s. Now, I was aware of the fact. Shall we get into Father Chorus now?
Please.
Okay. I was aware of the fact that there was an Orthodox community in Dublin. I had no idea where it was. Okay. Nobody seemed to know anything about it. And then when we moved here, I found out that Father Nicholas had died something like a year before. Now, in 1980 or 81, the church, the real community started here. Okay. Will I go back?
You mean here in Cork?
No, in Dublin. In Dublin. There were a scattering of Orthodox Christians throughout the country. But I remember in 1981 or 82, I remember going to Dublin, and there was the Pascha. And the entire Orthodox population of Ireland afterwards went into a restaurant in Bray called the Tree of Idleness. And most of them were from the Greek consulate or embassy, so there were a handful. Now, what had happened, however, though, and this is important, is that, in 1948, the Chinese communists took over the city of Harbin.
Right.
And they exiled anyone over the age of 40, and anyone under that had to go to the Soviet Union.
Or to somewhere else.
Or somewhere else, but for the most part, it was a group who could no longer have children that went into exile. And the Irish government in those days had a very bad record of taking in refugees. It was pretty awful. So a handful, I think a dozen, came to live here in Ireland. Some of them married Irish people. They're all, and this is the strange, it isn't strange, it's providential. Most of them are buried in this Mount St. Jerome Cemetery, which is around our church in Dublin. And that's by the work of the Holy Spirit or something, because that was not deliberate. In fact, when Father George, one of the first priests who went there, he was amazed because this other Orthodox man, who would have been one of Father Nicholas Chorus's parishioners, said to him, "Out there, there's Russian graves." Extraordinary. Even though Father Nicholas is not buried there, he's buried up north of Dublin. I'll tell you about him from what I know, because there's some things on your. It says that he was born in St. Petersburg. I believe he was born in Tsaskoye Selo. And he came from a very aristocratic family. And as such, he was an officer in one of these prestigious Life Guards or one of these kind of regiments.
So not necessarily that he was of Greek origin, as I...
He wasn't, no. No, he was definitely Russian. But probably...
Just somehow by
by something, the name, the surname is picked up, but he was not Greek. No, he was Russian, and He ended up, now I believe he was down on the Turkish front somewhere, so they were unaffected by the road, and he was with, now I never get the two straight, it's either Denikin or Wrangel, which is the general that retreated from the Crimea. Wrangel. He would have been at one of Wrangel's offices. He came to Constantinople when the Allies had occupied it, and he was there for a number of years. Now, what happened, as you know, Mr. Ulyanov decided to pull the passports away from all expats.
In 1922.
So all of these people had no papers. And he couldn't go anywhere, but he was involved, evidently, in raising funds for these white exile movement. He met a Quaker lady, and she came from Dublin, I understand, and she was involved in one of these international relief organizations. And she managed to get him a Nansen passport. Are you familiar with the
Nansen? Yes.
You know Nansen passport.
It's for display.
Fridtjof Nansen got these things
for Armenians and
League of Nations and stuff. So anyhow, armed with that, and at her invitation, and I don't know her name, again, that's information lost, he was invited to come to Ireland. They had some money, and they bought a farm up in North County Dublin somewhere, which probably cost them £100. I mean, it wouldn't have been like land today. And he evidently was the first person here to introduce mushroom farming. Again, where he learned this, I don't know. He and his wife and his son ran a mushroom farm. I also believe he taught equestrian studies to the Irish Army, which had just started. Show jumping and that kind of thing, because he was a superb horseman, evidently. Now, he also, and this is important, started a school of Russian language, and this would have been in the late 30s, and went through the Second World War.
Extraordinary.
Yeah. 2 of his students became infamous spies. These, oh God, what's their name? Burgess and McLean. They were both students learning Russian language. I suppose they came to Ireland, so nobody would know they were learning Russian language. Now, evidently, during the Second World War, the Irish government was very suspicious of anybody who was foreign or anything, and they were worried he was some kind of spy or something. And then, of course, when they found out after the war about Burgess and McLean, I guess there was some problems. But he had met Vladika Anthony when he first came over after the war, but he was convinced he was a Bolshevik agent or something. He was very paranoid, evidently. Now, what happened was, when this sort of diaspora of elderly people or aging people came from Harbin, the groups that came to Dublin, he got very friendly with them. And then, absolute tragic catastrophe happened. His son died and his wife died, and I believe it was all around the same time, maybe a year or two different. He went off to America then, and I believe he went to Jordanville, and he was ordained priest for the little community, and he came back. Now, there was never, there were several of these people I knew who were converts of his. And as near as I could tell from them, and I have that in this book, they used different rented accommodations, chapels here and there.
May I ask you, who was your source of information on Father Nicholas' background? How did you learn about him?
From Daphne Pushin Mold, from a guy named Rory, I can't think what his last name was, he was one of them. And
was they of Russian origin or they?
No.
No.
They're all converts.
All right.
He converted all these people. No, they're extraordinary.
Okay.
Daphne Pushin Mold has two spiritual parents. One was Father Nicholas, and the other was Princess Ileana of Romania.
All right.
You know, who went to Pennsylvania and started the
became a
monastery.
Yeah.
So she was her spiritual mother. So she was a wealth of information, and a lot of what I have, it comes from her or from this guy Rory, who knew him very well. Oddly enough, as I said, I was trying to find the Orthodox Church when I first came here. And when I saw it in the newspaper, so I went, and at that time, the priest was a Romanian by the name of Father Ireneo, and he still lives up in Dublin. And again, it was 6 or 7 people in this old Protestant church on Mary Street behind the post office, which had been lent to the Orthodox Church. There was no iconostasia, and it was absolutely bare. And so it was my first experience. This is probably 1980, I'm not sure what month. And there was a young boy there, maybe in his 20s, and his elderly mother. And I said, could I give you a lift home? Because I was staying with my father-in-law, who lived in a place called Foxtrot, Delighted. So in the car, and we were driving along. And I referred to this boy as John. And he says, well, actually, he says, that's my Orthodox name, because I just heard it when he went to communion. He said, my name is actually Drosten. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because I have a daughter who would have been Drosten if she was a boy. Really? He says, I says, yeah, my wife always liked that because she had a great friend. And she said, my friend Tessa has 2 brothers. One's called Denzel and the other's called Drosten. And the old lady in the back seat said, I have 2 sons named Drosten and Denzel. And it turns out that Drosten Grant and his mother are old friends of my wife's. She never knew they were Orthodox. She never knew any of this. So anyhow, strange again the way things work. So, and I ended up finally as godparent to one of Drosten's children. So he unfortunately died a few years ago, and Lady Penelope Grant died as well. So talking to I knew the people who knew Father Nicholas Chorus, and they would tell me stories. Now I can't tell where,
right?
But that information.
It's helpful,
It's just there.
Just for the sake of the record.
He did important things in Ireland. It's Daphne Pushamold, she's a geography as well as an archaeologist, is convinced he's responsible for mushroom farming in Ireland, okay? Now, anyhow, he had this small group. A couple of them were still alive when I came here in the late 70s. They were in nursing homes. And Father Aeneas used to go and anoint them. Okay, so there was that continuity. But I say there was no physical. So what really happens is in late 1980, there are several Romanian monks living in Dublin.
Really?
And they're part of a kind of window dressing thing that takes place between the Vatican on one hand and the Ceausescu regime, where the Vatican will allow clerics from Romania to come to the West to their various education things, where they can maybe do a PhD, Doctor of Theology, but most of them only stay a year. In fact, the Securitate evidently interviewed each one and said, now look, at the end of the year you say you're lonesome for Romania and you want to leave. Now, this is important, because there were 2 Father Aeneases here, and I can't, Theophil, I think was the other one's name, and they left, and Father Aeneas was a student in Maynooth, which is the big Catholic higher institution, the seminary. And there were 2 Greek Cypriots living in Dublin. One was named Phrixus Ioannidis. He was professor of engineering in Trinity. And the other's name was Phoebus Moussolidis. He was an olive oil importer. And they went to Bishop Methodius, who was the Bishop of Thyatira in London, and asked him. They said, we actually have priests in London, and we have a community, 20, 30 people, mostly involved in the consul or the embassy. Can we have a liturgy? And they made an agreement with the Church of Ireland, because the Church of Ireland had an awful lot of unused churches they couldn't even heat. No congregations, just big buildings. And so there was this church on Mary Street, which is now I think it's a pub or something. I don't know. It's just awful when I think about it. Which was lent to the community, and so they started having liturgies, and that's when I found it. Okay, there were other, so like me, there were other Orthodox people nobody knew about who saw about and came. So it acted as a magnet, and so this little community started, and
So this community kind of included those who were members of Father Nicholas' community,
yes,
sort of incorporated them.
yes, they were only a minority. There was there was this guy Rory. I can't think of his name, but Father Nicholas could tell you his name. I can't remember. So he's dead now. And this Grant family. They were the only two actually families left, beside these people, which were in nursing homes.
Right.
Now, evidently, Vladika Anthony of Soros and Bishop Methodius said, we will have a joint parish for all the Orthodox who live in Ireland. That's how it started. Unfortunately, I think a little bit of Greek nationalism rose to the fore, and the Russian thing got kind of ignored. Right. But anyhow, originally it was to be a joint administered thing by the two dioceses. Okay. The other two Romanian monks left. One was killed in Jerusalem, we think murdered by the Securitate, and because he never went back to Romania, even though he was warned to. I don't know what happened to the other one. Maybe he went back. Father Ines ends up as the priest in charge, paid a small stipend by the Greek diocese, and we were off and running.
So he was a Romanian, though a clergyman of the Greek archdiocese here.
That's what he became. Yeah, yeah. Now, after he was here about 2 years, he got and it was quite obvious he was serious about getting his PhD. He was starting to get threatening phone calls. I know this because I heard them. One of the very devout parishioners, in fact, he's the priest now.
And you mean the phone calls from Securitate?
As well as a bishop in Romania, who I think is no longer a bishop, saying you have to come back. There was an unwritten agreement that you would stay for a year or two. This is only a window dressing. This isn't reality. There's a priest up in Dublin now, Father Reneo Carroll. He is priest in the Greek Church. He was an ex-member of the Irish Air Force. In fact, he was a pilot. He used to fly important politicians around, like the Prime Minister. And there was a question of whether Father Aeneas might lose his visa. He saw to it that he didn't. And so, but in effect, Father Aeneas ended up as a permanent exile. He would have trouble going back.
Right.
So it was years before him, but he didn't go back until after Ceausescu had died and the regime collapsed. So that's how it went, and gradually we started. And then the major influx, though, is when Romania comes into the European Union. And then we started getting lots of immigration over here. And shortly after that, we got Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, the Czech Republic. And so most of, for example, the parishioners don't actually, they'll say they're Russian, but they actually come from the Baltic countries or Poland. So, I mean, Father Nicholas is one of the few Russians. He's not even really Russian. As he told you, he's actually Chuvash. Yeah. But the point is, they're more Russian by tradition and language than actually, they didn't really live in Russia. And so that's where all those people are able to come here, which is wonderful. Now, we used to have a small group. We used to come down to Cork once a year. There was a handful of a few Serbs living down here, a Greek-American girl, a couple of Romanians.
What would you do? You will travel to Dublin I mean,
I would.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, my two of my sons were born here. We had them christened up there. The other thing has
To
happened.
that Romanian parish that you mentioned.
Yes, it was
that would be your church.
It was a Greek. It was the only church we really had.
Mm-hmm.
When the Romanians started coming, they sort of formed a sub parish up there.
Okay.
Okay, they would have sometimes their own liturgy and so forth. And,
right.
Yeah. What happened was once the real influx of Romanians came, there were two jurisdictions in Paris. One which is separate, like the Russian Church abroad.
Right.
Yeah. And it was one of their bishops, I think, who first started coming over here, and he organized so that
from Rue de Rue, this church. That the Russian jurisdiction that is based in Paris, right? From that group, that's what you mean?
No.
Oh, from Romania.
From Romania.
I see.
There was evidently, most people don't know this, there was two Romanian jurisdictions in Paris as well.
Yes.
One of which, I don't even know if they're in communion with each other, but they were certainly separate.
Like Romanian Church abroad.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And they, one of their bishops came over, and there was one of the parishioners who is now a priest from the Romanian church, but he was originally a Roman Catholic priest. In fact, he was a Jesuit, okay? And he left the Catholic Church. He got married, and he was ordained as a priest for a separate Romanian parish up in Dublin, and he's still there. Okay, so that original parish is really the nucleus of an awful lot that happened. In fact, when the real Russian diaspora began coming in here, Father Michael Gugolov, have you met him? He lives in Bath in England. He was here for years, big guy, yeah. And he started coming maybe every 8 weeks or something to Dublin, and I used to always go up for his liturgies.
So basically, he started a new parish.
He started the Russian thing
in the mid 1990s. Something.
Yeah, but it was all still taking place in the Greek church.
Again, really?
Everything was taking place. The Greek church moved. There was the church on Mary Street, which then became a pub, and we were kicked out of there on a funny thing. And then we were given a totally disused building, which was evidently a church for the servants of Church of Ireland members.
Okay.
It had an old tin roof, and they used to have karate classes in there during the week, and we had the place. But one of my sons was christened there.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, after a number of years, I can't remember the exact date, but I'll look it up for you. We were able to purchase a building on a place called Arbor Hill, which is where the present Greek church is.
But Greek church existed parallelly with Father Nicholas Curie, so
No.
The only Father Nicholas
has died.
Okay.
So they started that up all new.
I see.
But supposedly it was part of a Russian jurisdiction as well, because Bishop Anthony of Soroj gave blessing for this.
It's not like anything else existed.
No.
So only his community was. Okay.
But gradually, he never came over here. Bishop Callistus, Timothy Ware, came over here on several occasions. I met him several times, and I just don't think there was any kind of a Russian presence there. So it just sort of passed. I'm sorry.
I met Father Godfrey, and he told me, and I asked him about Father Nicholas Curis, and he told me that he remembered how Mstislav Rostropovich came to play in Dublin, and after his concert, he asked to visit some elderly Russian people, and he played for them. Somehow he arranged that he would play for them privately.
They would be that little remnant that came from Harbin. So, there's one other thing to be mentioned. There was another priest who came here for a very short period of time. I know very little about him except he was an engineer, I believe, or a chemist or something, taught in Trinity, and he was only here a matter of months, and he had a coronary, and he died.
Right.
So,
And he was
assisting Father Chorus, yeah.
Oh, really? Was he?
Yes.
I thought there was some French professor of French at Trinity College.
No.
Who used to be a priest for like a couple of years in the early 1970s.
No. Yeah, see, that's what you're confusing it. This
All
guy, I have his name here somewhere.
Right.
Yeah. He wasn't French. No, I think he.
No, I mean he taught French.
No.
No.
Oh, possibly. No, I thought he taught engineering.
He was a French professor, but he was part
of Trinity
because somebody who went to Trinity.
Yeah,
but George Woodman, who went to Trinity, he told me about.
He only lived for a year or two here.
I see.
Very short time.
Right.
No, what you might be confusing with, there was an engineer guy, a French, whose wife was French, who would be godfather to one of my children.
No, I don't know about him.
But he was never a priest, but he was a very good musician, and he directed the choir.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And that person was a Moscow Patriarchate priest. This French language professor.
Well, but I thought he was English. I'll look at.
Yes, he was English. Sure.
Yeah. Okay, but he was ordained in.
He was not with Father Nicholas. That's what I'm saying. That he.
Well, I thought they worked together. I'll look it up in my note. Okay. I have that written. It's sort of a sub-note. Anyhow, see what happens where everything gets muddled easily. Okay, now where am I going to? I go off on terrible tangents.
No, I derailed you.
Yeah. But anyhow, what happened was the church moved its site several times. So finally, in the 90s, a school, which in a place called Arbor Hill, which is quite famous in Irish history because it was a British military base. It was where all these guys were executed after the 1916 uprising, and it's quite a very important nationalistic place. Up there on Arbor Hill, which is an old working class neighborhood, little small brick buildings, there was a school, and that school was for the children of the British Army soldiers in the barracks. And that was turned into the first permanent Orthodox church, and it's still there. Okay? It's still, do we lose that picture?
No.
And it's still there. And Father Thomas Carroll is the priest there. Okay. Again, he's the one that helped Father Irenaeus. He calls himself, he's Father Irenaeus as well. So there was a long history of moving, okay? Now, anyhow, I remember going up and Father Michael Gogoloff, and I met him. And a few months later, maybe a year later, it's not awful, I can't think of people's names. He wasn't the patriarch at the time.
Alexis?
No.
Of the Russian church?
Yeah, not the present patriarch. Kirill.
Kirill, right.
Yeah, Kirill of Smolensk came.
Really?
Yes, and they had this wonderful liturgy in the Greek church. And Father Michael introduced me to him, and he said, "What's going in Cork?" And I said, "Well, Father, we have a liturgy once a year." He said, "I will remember that. I will take care of you." And he did, because as soon as things were organized in Dublin, Father Michael and this new priest, Father George, came down to Dublin, and I organized a meeting, and we advertised it in some local newspapers, and we had a large gathering of Russian speakers in a hotel not far from here. And that's how that was 10 years ago.
And Father Michael, he was born in France, I understand.
He's born in Lyon, yeah.
Right. He's a Russian from France.
Well, evidently both his parents, his his grandfathers on both sides were both officers in the White Army who came back. They must have had some money, so they were settled in France. And then his parents met through them, and he was the result. Right. But he was trained as an engineer, and he worked in places like Africa. And he ended up doing a big job in Moscow. And while he was there, he was ordained a deacon in Moscow.
Thank you very much.
He knows everybody. That's quite extraordinary. And I went to Divyevo with him.
Really?
And I met all kinds of people in Moscow that are friends. And I met the patriarch. Well, again, he was still director of external affairs. And I met all these people like, Father Chaplin that runs the television network. Extraordinary. But we have an interesting thing. Another thing that happened, when the church was started up and now the Russian church, this monk comes, Hilarion was his name, and he started the choir, and he's Vladika Hilarion now of Vienna. Extraordinary. The connections with this little Irish church and the Russian church as a whole are quite extraordinary, I think.
Indeed. Yeah. And now, after so Father George succeeded to Father Michael, and now Father Nicholas
and the other Father
is taking care of it.
And now I think there are 8 parishes, I think. Somebody asked me how many parishes, and I started adding them up. I think there's about 8, because Father Nikolai looks after Drogheda, he looks after Cork, he looks after Waterford, and he goes to Galway. That's 4. And then there's a joint parish. Oh, this is interesting. There's a man about my age who comes from very now wealthy aristocratic Irish background. And he lives in a place called Stradbally Hall, which is an enormous place. And he became Orthodox. And on his property, he built a small Orthodox church. And I remember that well. There was, because my friend Drustin Grant, who died, who I mentioned to you, he came down to Dublin. I was up in Dublin one time, and he introduced me to these 2 Russian architects who were doing some work, I don't know, maybe Trinity, and they designed the cupola for that church down in Stradbally.
Oh, okay.
And I went down for the dedication of that. Bishop Mark of Berlin came over. There was at least one christening that day. And now, Stradbally Hall, as it's called, the church is still there, but it's very famous because there's this international rock festival that takes place there every year called something, I don't know what it's called.
It's not far away from Cork, right?
No, it's closer to Dublin.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now, Father George still goes there.
Right.
But that's a joint administration between the Russian Church abroad and the Patriarch.
But does this place has any congregation, or it's just sort of like a house church?
Well, there were several people. There was a Latvian family, Russian-speaking Latvian family that's down here in Cork. They go there. There's a guy who lives in... There's quite a few people now who will travel up there. This is not that far. They live in North Cork. It's an hour's drive.
Okay, so this place,
but then there are some converts from Anglicanism that go there as well.
Okay.
Because this man, he was very well connected. What's his name? Terrible, I can't remember. This even happens when you get old. Every time all the facts go out of your head. It come to me in a moment. Doesn't make any difference.
Okay.
But again, it's a mixture of things, but it's viable. And, all of the only failure was, and I don't know what happened. There was an attempt to set up an Orthodox parish in Limerick, and Father George was out there, And I went to liturgy there with my wife one time, and about 5 people came in this huge, big church. But it just never materialized. The other thing I think should really be emphasized is how kind the Catholic authorities in this country have been toward us. I believe initially there was a bit of suspicion, but the Catholic Bishop of Dublin, loves coming to the Russian church. He said to me one time, I love coming in here because nobody gives me a bad time because of all the child abuse and all that stuff.
So it's recently, is that what he said?
A few years back, yeah. Okay. But we get along very, very well with them. But in general, I think Catholics feel, they find it strange, they don't understand a lot of it, but at the same time, they're quite fascinated. Years ago, we had a pilgrimage from the Greek church to a place called Clonmacnoise, which is very famous, a famous monastery and so forth. And the Bishop of Rome was here on his visit in 1979. He did liturgy there. Okay. But essentially, because of the queer separation of church and state, what happened was, there's a thing called the Act of Settlement, which takes place in the 1880s, in which the Church of Ireland was no longer the state church, and they could no longer maintain their properties, so they gave them to what became known as the Board of Works, okay? With the stipulation they never be used for public worship. Okay, so it's actually against the law to go in. Now that's been violated all over the time. But anyhow, we dutifully went to the Protestant Bishop of Dublin and said, can we use one of your chapels? And they said, yes.
An Anglican bishop, right?
Anglican bishop. Yeah. So we had this pilgrimage there. And at that time, 2 of my children were very small and they were acting up. And so I took them outside. But the incense was, the church is much bigger than this, these tiny little churches. And the incense is coming out and beautiful singing. And there were these ladies standing there, and they were fascinated. And I realized, talking to them, they were holy nuns from the Catholic Church. And one of them had tears in her eyes. And she said, what are you doing? And I said, we're having Orthodox, we're on a little pilgrimage as our Orthodox religion. And she said, can I go in? And I was so packed, I said, go in. So she came in, stood for a few minutes and came out. And she said, we used to have all that and we gave it up. And I thought, I felt so bad for her,
That's very strong, very strong.
Sad. Because she was she was much older than me at the time, so she remembered the old Tridentine liturgies that they had. And I found that throughout, I say, you run into these misunderstandings. At one time, I was sitting with one of my children, and it's small, and this Catholic priest was an elderly man, and I was chatting with him, and he said, do you mind if I bless your child? And maybe I didn't. Yeah, okay. He says, you are Catholic, aren't you? And I said, well, we Orthodox consider ourselves catecholos as well. Yes. And he says, that's okay, Jews go to heaven. And I thought, well, okay. And Father Irenaeus one time, he always wore a soutane, you see. And he was sitting in a waiting room in some hospital. He had a medical card. And somebody called him and said, Rabbi, you're next. I said, well, it's okay. So it's kind of funny. They didn't quite understand who we were, and they just thought maybe we were Jewish, which is okay. I don't care. But they just didn't grasp what. I don't think it's ever taught. I know when my children were in school, I said, do you learn anything about the Byzantine Empire? The Great? No.
Wow.
So they knew absolutely nothing about it. I saw a newspaper article one time at Christmas, and it says, St. Nicholas, yes, he was a Turkish bishop. You think, okay, this is what you're up against, you see. Right. But the point is, they have been very kind to us. Bishop John Buckley, I had a heart attack. The Bishop of Cork came in to visit me, which I thought was quite extraordinary. I was quite taken aback by that, So we have very good relations with them. The little church that we use, they won't take any rent or anything from us. So every year I buy a big hamper of food, wine, and I give it. It's the least I can do. And I've taken the abbot out for lunch a few times, just because I feel so guilty about the fact that they won't.
No, that was thank you. That was an extraordinary interview, and you are a link that connects with this history, and also it's interesting about the witness to the outsiders that the Orthodox have been able to make.
Can I just add one more thing?
Please.
I know I'm an awful windbag here, but there are two Catholic saints in Cork. I mean, they're not really declared saints, but everybody regards them. One of them was a wonderful woman who started schools for poor children. Her name is, she was Anne, or Nano, she's called, Nano Nagel. She came from a wealthy family, gave it all up, and worked her whole life serving the poor. She is buried in a school in Cork. That's where the Romanian community worships. Okay? Another famous person, again, he came from more of a Protestant family. He was wealthy, and his name was Father Matthew. And Father Matthew started what they call temperance movement, trying to get men to not drink so much. And he, and it's in the church that he built is where we have our. So I always say the two undeclared Catholic saints here in Cork look after the two Orthodox communities, which is very nice.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
You got enough information there?